From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
On all levels, justice has hit rock bottom. We are dealing with a dreadful government, and I hope that at least what will result is that the Mexican people express their anger and something serious occurs.
Protesters in Mexico City set fire to the door of the ceremonial presidential palace Sunday as tens of thousands marched to condemn the apparent massacre of 43 students who've been missing for 6 weeks. Human rights groups say the killings are the worst atrocity Mexico has seen in years. On Friday, the Mexican government accused a drug gang of carrying out the massacre. Then to Iraq.
We're now in a position to start going on some offense. The airstrikes have been very effective in degrading ISIL's capabilities and slowing the advance that they were making. Now what we need is ground troops, Iraqi ground troops, that can start pushing them back.
As President Obama deploys 1,500 more troops to Iraq, we'll speak with Matthew Ho, the former Marine and State Department official who once served in Iraq. In 2009, he became the first known U.S. official to resign in protest over the Afghan war. And we'll speak with a Yale graduate student in public health who just completed 21 days in quarantine after returning from Liberia. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Obama's authorized the deployment of an additional 1,500 troops to Iraq, more than doubling the current U.S. force. Pentagon press spokesperson John Kirby unveiled the plan on Friday.
The Commander-in-Chief has authorized Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel to deploy to Iraq up to 1,500 additional U.S. personnel over the coming months in a non-combat role to expand our advise and assist mission and initiate a comprehensive training effort for Iraqi forces. Secretary Hagel made this recommendation to the President based on the request of the government of Iraq, U.S. Central Command's assessment of Iraqi units, the progress Iraqi security forces have made in the field, and in concert with the development of a coalition campaign plan to defend key areas and go on the offensive against ISIL.
In a significant expansion of the American military campaign against ISIS, military advisors will reportedly establish training sites across Iraq. The $5.6 billion plan is expected to go before Congress during the lame duck session beginning this week. The U.S. military expansion in Iraq comes amidst conflicting reports over the fate of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Iraqi officials claim he was wounded in an airstrike on ISIS leaders in Iraq's Anbar province. We'll have more on Iraq later in the broadcast. We'll be speaking with former Marine Matthew Ho. The U.S. and Iran have opened a new round of talks ahead of the deadline for reaching a nuclear agreement 2 weeks from today. A long-term deal would allow Iranian uranium enrichment and relief from U.S.-led sanctions in return for extensive international inspections. On Sunday, Secretary of State John Kerry met with Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif in Oman. Zarif said easing the sanctions remains a critical issue.
But I think the most important issues that need to be addressed are enrichment and sanctions. It is important for the West to understand that sanctions have never contributed to the resolution of this issue. Sanctions are not a part of the solution. Sanctions are the most important part of the problem. They're illegal in nature. They must be removed. They have not produced any positive result. The only thing that sanctions have produced for the West are about 19,000 centrifuges.
Speaking to CBS News on Sunday, President Obama said there's still a big gap between the two sides and that a deal may not be within reach. It emerged last week Obama wrote a letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, outlining a mutual interest in opposing the Islamic State and coming to terms on a nuclear deal. President Obama has tapped Brooklyn federal prosecutor Loretta Lynch to replace Eric Holder as Attorney General. Obama formally unveiled Lynch's nomination at the White House Saturday.
It's pretty hard to be more qualified for this job than Loretta. Throughout her 30-year career, she has distinguished herself as tough, as fair, an independent lawyer who has twice headed one of the most prominent U.S. attorney's offices in the country. She has spent years in the trenches as a prosecutor, aggressively fighting terrorism, financial fraud, cybercrime, all while vigorously defending civil rights.
If confirmed as Attorney General, Loretta Lynch would be the first African-American woman to hold the position. In brief remarks, she thanked President Obama and pledged to defend the rights of all citizens.
Mr. President, thank you again for the faith that you've placed in me. I pledge today to you and to the American people that if I have the honor of being confirmed by the Senate, I will wake up every morning with the protection of the American people my first thought. And I will work every day to safeguard our citizens, our liberties, our rights, and this great nation, which has given so much to me and my family.
2 Americans have returned to the U.S. after being freed from imprisonment in North Korea. Kenneth Bay and Matthew Todd Miller were released in a deal reportedly brokered by the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Bay made a brief statement upon their return.
It's been amazing 2 years. I learned a lot. I grew a lot. Lost a lot of weight in a good way. But I'm standing strong because of you. And thank you for being there at such a time as this. So I just want to say tonight that thank you for all your support and prayer and your love. That has really been encouraging for me and for others that who are in the same shoes in DPRK and elsewhere. Thank you.
Bay and Miller had been sentenced to years of hard labor. North Korean state media claims the 2 were released after President Obama conveyed a, quote, earnest apology for their actions. Protests are continuing across Mexico after the apparent confession of gang members for the massacre of 43 college students in the southern state of Guerrero 6 weeks ago. On Friday, the Mexican Attorney General said suspects in the case admitted to killing the students and incinerating their bodies, leading investigators to the remains. The students disappeared following a police ambush, fueling public anger over government corruption and Mexico's endemic violence. On Saturday, a breakaway group of protesters set fire to the door of the presidential palace in Mexico City after a march that drew thousands of people. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto has drawn criticism for leaving Mexico to attend the APEC summit in China amidst the unrest. A new report from a leading Mexican journalist says Peña Nieto lives in a private mansion owned by a contractor who received a lucrative government contract to build high-speed rail. We'll have more from Mexico after headlines. Protests have broken out in Arab-Israeli areas of Israel after the fatal shooting of a young man. The victim apparently tried to attack police with a knife after they came to arrest a relative. But video footage shows the incident shows police shot him dead as he tried to run away. Arab-Israeli communities then observed a 24-hour strike beginning Sunday. Earlier today, a Palestinian man allegedly stabbed an Israeli soldier in Tel Aviv, leaving the soldier critically wounded. A committee within the Israeli cabinet, meanwhile, has approved a measure that would apply all Israeli laws to Jewish settlers in the occupied West Bank. The measure was backed by lawmakers who want to formally annex the West Bank settlement blocks into Israel. In a symbolic gesture, a group of young Palestinian activists marked Saturday's 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall by breaking through a portion of the separation wall that bisects the occupied West Bank. In a statement, the Palestinian Popular Committee said, quote, no matter how high walls are built, they will fall. Just as the Berlin Wall fell, the wall in Palestine will fall, along with the occupation, they said. The fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. At a 25th anniversary ceremony in Berlin, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the historic event carries a message for today.
It showed that we have the power to shape our destiny and make things better. That is the message of the fall of the wall. It is directed at us in Germany, but also at others in Europe and the world, especially to people in Ukraine, in Syria, Iraq, and other regions where human rights are threatened or violated.
Around 1.6 million people in the Spanish region of Catalonia have voted to back secession. Close to 2 million took part in the referendum, less than half of those eligible. The vote's non-binding, and Spain says it will not be recognized. The latest job figures show the official unemployment rate has fallen to a 6-year low of 5.8%. Despite the improved job growth, Jason Furman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors acknowledged wages remain stagnant.
You'd always love to see more job growth, but 229,000 jobs per month in 2014 is the fastest pace since the late 1990s. It's consistent with a rapidly declining unemployment rate, and what we really want to see is it translating into even larger gains in wages.
And a Detroit judge has approved the city's effort to restructure finances and shed around $7 billion in debt under its bankruptcy filing last year. The plan includes cuts to retiree pensions for city workers and around $660 million in funding from state and private sources. Detroit Council President Brenda Jones said the city's next phase of recovery should focus on community improvement.
We must empower and employ the long-suffering people of Detroit. Just as we will work through a plan of adjustment after bankruptcy, a plan for our people is critical. So while we celebrate our city's exit from bankruptcy, let's refocus our efforts on getting citizens back to work, making our streets and neighborhoods safer, and rebuilding our population by creating a thriving and growing city.
The deal ends 16 months of bankruptcy proceedings. It'll let Detroit spend nearly $2 billion to restore some of the basic public services that have all but disappeared in recent years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today in Mexico, where protesters set fire to the presidential palace over the weekend following news that 43 students missing for more than 6 weeks have been massacred. The students, who are from a rural teachers' college, went missing following a police ambush in the southern state of Guerrero in late September. The mayor of the city of Iguala and his wife are suspected of ordering the attack by police, which left 6 people dead. It's believed the police then turned the students over to a local drug gang with close ties to the mayor and his wife. More than 70 people have been arrested in the case, many of them police. On Friday, the Mexican Attorney General, Jesus Murillo Caram, said 2 suspects had led authorities to trash bags believed to contain the remains of the students. He said the detainees confessed to shooting the survivors and incinerating their bodies.
The detainees pointed out that in this area, they took the lives of the survivors, and then they put them under the rubbish dump where they burnt the bodies. They took shifts so that the fire lasted hours, using diesel, petrol, tires, plastic. I reiterate, we are making sure that the group of people that gang members detained, that they transported, that they took to this place, burnt them, and then threw them into the river, are what happened in the incident that took place in Iguala.
The announcement brought to a head weeks of outrage, which has brought tens of thousands of people into the streets. In Mexico City, at least 14 people were arrested after a breakaway group of protesters stormed the ceremonial presidential palace, setting fire to the door. In Guerrero State, where the students went missing, protesters set fire to cars and trucks outside the office of the governor, who was recently forced to resign over the crisis. An offhand remark by the Mexican Attorney General has become the rallying cry for the protests. At the end of his address on Friday, Mexican Attorney General Murillo Caram stopped taking questions, saying, quote, "Enough, I'm tired." That comment, taken up by protesters who say they're tired of killings, tired of impunity, tired of repression, and tired of the federal government's failure to control the rampant corruption of local authorities. The families of the students say that until the remains are identified as their loved ones, they refuse to believe they're dead.
We want to say that as parents of the students that in no way do we accept this declaration that was given because Attorney General Jesus Murillo, he himself included, has said that he is not sure that it is for certain. With this, we don't want to say that we're closed to any results. We want results, but with proof. The moment that we as parents of the students, as family, are sure of what the Attorney General is saying is the truth, only at this moment will we accept it, whatever the result.
of Guerrero, where we're joined by Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez, coordinator of the advocacy unit for Tlachi Noyan, a human rights group working with the families of the 43 missing students. She's joining us by Democracy Now! Audio stream from Tixla de Guerrero, where Ayotzinapa, the school which the missing students attended, is located. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about what was discovered over the weekend, Maria?
Yes, so the Attorney General went to meet with the students' parents, and he gave the information that then he gave publicly. And I think the results were basically what we have been saying for a long time, that it's that no one actually has confidence on the state anymore. So the parents have been very clear that only with concrete proof, and also proof that it's accompanied by the decision of their independent experts, the forensic independent experts that they brought to the table, the Argentinian group, they will recognize any information that the Attorney General gives. And I think it's also what we have seen from all over the country, that the confidence on the state and on the authorities are very diminished. So now we need to, well, the state needs to build on trust and actually give concrete proof, so then they can recognize where the students are. And in the meantime, the parents demand that they continue to look for them, and they continue to look for them alive.
Maria Luisa, for people who are not familiar with the story, although to say the least it has consumed Mexico, explain what's believed to have happened.
Well, the students went to do some fundraising in Iguala, which is like, I think like 2 hours away from where they are based. And they were taking some buses, and then they were followed by some police who start using lethal force against them without any warning. There were at least 4 different events where they were violent, and where municipality police was involved, but also some other plainclothes people who are believed to be related with organized crime. We need to remember that Guerrero is one of the states with the highest violence rates in Mexico. And then the students were, 6 people died during the events, 3 of them students, out of lethal force from either from the police or the plainclothes persons, but also 42 students disappeared. This was more than 44 days ago.
Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto condemned both the apparent massacre and the protests that took place over the weekend.
The government, for its part, shares with the Mexican people the sense of pain, as well with Ayotzinapa. And it must be said, this is a call for justice, a call for peace, unity, and not violence nor confrontation. It's unacceptable that someone should try to use this tragedy to justify violence. You can't demand justice while acting with violence.
Maria Luisa, can you respond to that? And the response to the president leaving for China amidst this massive unrest in Mexico?
Yes, so I think the parents are very concerned that the state is not putting the attention that this crisis needs. Which is represented in the fact that the state, the president left for this visit. And also our biggest concern is that they basically had to move forward to give any kind of information, which it's related to the events that the witness gave some information to that. But what it will seem to be the state to be done is that they have to close the case very quick, so then they can stop with the manifestations and the demonstrations, and also to give just, like to pass the page. And what we have seen is that this case is a turning point. I mean, we cannot go back to what every day was happening in Mexico. We have at least 22,000 people that have been recognized by the state that they are disappeared. I mean, Ayotzinapa is just an emblematic case of what the crisis is, but it's not an isolated case.
Can you talk about the Mexican Attorney General saying at the end of his news conference, "Ya me canse," or "I've had enough," and what that has become?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure he's tired, but the parents are more tired than him, and the people in Mexico are like really tired of impunity and lack of trust in our institutions. So I think it's also the reflection of what happens here. I mean, they have political will in this case because of the pressure that they are feeling from the international community and inside of Mexico. But even with all this political will, Mexico does not have the capacity to look for 42 students and does not have the capacity to look for 22,000 people that are disappeared. So we have to start looking about what we are lacking and to recognize the magnitude of the crisis.
Finally, Maria Luisa, what this means for Mexico right now. Some people are saying the government could fall. People are calling, of course, for the resignation of the Attorney General. What is happening overall?
I think what is happening is that this was like the trigger for everybody to recognize once again this crisis in which we are. It's a humanitarian crisis, a human rights crisis. We're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of people who are disappeared, but also tens of thousands of people who have been killed in some much of a violence that it's like generalized, and it's that something needs to be done. I mean, it's not only about how to react to this case, but also how to react to all the situation and how to build trust in authorities, and also to regain our social tissue that it's all decomposed.
You're joining us from Tixla de Guerrero, which has a history of activism. As we wrap up, can you describe that history and what is happening there now?
Yeah, well, the Tixla is where the school is based. The school has a long history of activism and also of education for the students, among the students, of highly politicized education. And I mean, this is a school for poor people, for people who doesn't have any other opportunity to access to education or to access to higher education. But also with a perspective that they need to go back to the communities and bring some tools and political tools to the community, so then they can start, like reflecting on social justice and some other things that really we don't see in the regular educational system.
Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez, I thank you for being with us, coordinator of the Advocacy Unit for Tlachinoyan, a human rights group working with the families of the 43 missing students, joining us from Tixla in the southern state of Guerrero in Mexico. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. As the nation prepares to commemorate Veterans Day, we will speak with Matthew Ho. He is a veteran and a government official who quit over the Afghan war. We'll talk to him about what's happening in Iraq, the deployment of even more U.S. troops. Stay with us. Iraqi musician Farhat Kaduri here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the nation prepares to commemorate Veterans Day, President Obama's authorized the deployment of an additional 1,500 troops to Iraq. The plan will more than double the current U.S. force in Iraq and will reportedly cost $5.6 billion. At a news conference Friday, Pentagon Press Secretary Rear Admiral John Kirby announced the decision.
The Commander-in-Chief has authorized Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel to deploy to Iraq up to 1,500 additional U.S. personnel over the coming months in a non-combat role to expand our advise and assist mission and initiate a comprehensive training effort for Iraqi forces. Secretary Hagel made this recommendation to the President based on the request of the government of Iraq, U.S. Central Command's assessment of Iraqi units, the progress Iraqi security forces have made in the field, and in concert with the development of a coalition campaign plan to defend key areas and go on the offensive against ISIL.
That was Pentagon Press Secretary Rear Admiral John Kirby. In a significant expansion of the U.S. military campaign against ISIS, military advisors will reportedly establish training sites across Iraq. The request for $5.6 billion will reportedly be presented to Congress during the lame duck session that begins this week. In an interview on CBS's Face the Nation broadcast Sunday, President Obama said the increased troop deployment to Iraq marks a new phase against Islamic State militants, an offensive strategy rather than a defensive one.
We're now in a position to start going on some offense. The airstrikes have been very effective in degrading ISIL's capabilities and slowing the advance that they were making. Now what we need is ground troops, Iraqi ground troops, that can start pushing them back.
The timing of the announcement has raised questions about whether the Obama administration waited until after the midterm elections in order to shield Democratic candidates from war-weary voters. The anti-war group Code Pink has criticized Obama for sending more troops to Iraq, saying in a statement, quote, "For months we've been hearing no boots on the ground over and over from the administration. When will we learn from our mistakes and stop repeating history?" they wrote. Well, for more, we go to Raleigh, North Carolina, where we're joined by Matthew Ho, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, former State Department official who resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan over the U.S. policy there in September 2009. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew Ho served in Iraq. From 2004 to 2005, he worked with the State Department Reconstruction and Governments team in Salah ad-Din province. And from 2006 to 2007, he worked as a Marine Corps company commander in Anbar province. Matthew Ho, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you share your response to the increased boots on the ground?
Hi, good morning, and thank you for having me on. My response is as many people, I think, in the United States scratching their head and wondering, what are we doing? What does the United States government really think it's going to accomplish by putting more American troops into the middle of the Iraqi civil war and into the middle of the Syrian civil war, particularly coming off of 13 years of war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen, et cetera. So my response, Amy, is more or less the same as most people's, of a very concerned and, you know, lack of a better phrase, this is crazy.
CBS's Face the Nation, President Obama insisted U.S. troops will focus on training Iraqis to fight ISIS and coordinating airstrikes rather than engaging in active combat.
What hasn't changed is our troops are not engaged in combat. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking 4 training centers with coalition members that allow us to bring in Iraqi recruits, some of the Sunni tribes that are still resisting ISIL, giving them proper training, proper equipment, helping them with strategy, helping them with logistics. We will provide them close air support once they are prepared to start going on the offense against ISIL. But what we will not be doing is having our troops do the fighting.
President Obama refused to rule out further increases in U.S. troops in Iraq.
Commander-in-Chief, I'm never going to say never, but what the commanders who presented the plan to me say is that we may actually see fewer troops over time, because now we're seeing coalition members starting to partner with us on the training and assist effort.
That is President Obama on CBS's Face the Nation. Matthew Ho, do you believe what he's saying?
No, I don't. And I think it's very easy for us to revisit this in a few months' time, just as now we're revisiting this from several months ago, and see the increase, the graduation of entry of American forces back into the conflict. I think it's a slippery slope, excuse me, and that very quickly this will spin out of control for the United States. What happens when American troops are killed? What happens when we lose several young men to a suicide bomber? How is the president going to react to that? How is the United States going to react when our troops are in combat and we only have 3,000, and the president, who can't seem to face down the same critics in Congress who are always demanding for war, the John McCains and Lindsey Graham, how is he going to face them down then if he can't face them down now? So I don't believe his words, and I think that this is going to be the beginning of an unfortunate and tragic re-entry of America back into this civil war.
Your response to the fate of the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Iraqi officials claim he was wounded in an airstrike on ISIS leaders in Iraq's Anbar province where you were, Matthew Ho.
It may be true. I mean, certainly it could possibly happen, but I don't put much stock in that having a great effect on the Islamic State. They'll just get another leader. Look, Osama bin Laden's been dead for 3.5 years, and the administration is citing how dangerous al-Qaeda still is in order to justify spying on Americans, in order to justify bombing in Syria. The precursor to the Islamic State, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which didn't exist, of course, until we invaded Iraq, but al-Qaeda in Iraq, which morphed into the Islamic State, their leader, Zakari, was killed in 2006, and here we are now in 2014, facing an even stronger, more dangerous, more barbaric force in the Islamic State. So I don't, if he's dead, you know, I don't think it's going to affect things in the mid or long terms in terms of what's occurring in Iraq, what's occurring in Syria, because the issues here go well beyond one man or one group. It goes into issues relating to sectarian violence that has been fostered and pushed by policies from the United States, from the West, from the Gulf nations that have created this Frankenstein ISIS and that have enabled the environment for civil war to flourish.
Can you talk more about that, how ISIS was created, its support, and what you feel is the alternative?
Sure. Well, the Islamic State, as I just mentioned, came from the al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was an organization that sprang to life after the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, one of the things that when I was there in Iraq, as well as in the State Department and the Pentagon in D.C., one of the things we always noticed about it, and one of the things that we saw, was that it was, while it had a number of foreign fighters in it, a number of young men who were coming from other Arab nations to fight against the Americans in Iraq, very often, the majority of the constituency of al-Qaeda in Iraq were Iraqis. In 2006, 2007, because so many people were supporting al-Qaeda in Iraq based on sectarian reasons. So basically what was occurring in Iraq was you had this civil war, so the Sunnis in Iraq were supporting al-Qaeda because they had no other choice. In 2006, 2007, we made a deal with the Sunnis. We gave them money. We brought them back into the power structure. We pulled Shia forces out of the Sunni areas. And so the Sunnis then turned on al-Qaeda. What happened after that was when the United States left in 2011, the Shia government in Baghdad, which is incredibly corrupt, relentlessly went after the Sunnis. They persecuted them to an extent that I don't think people realize the violence behind that. This wasn't just excluding the Sunnis from government. This was actively killing them, actively chasing them from their homes, actively actively arresting them in mass numbers, to the point that the Sunnis have revolted and have thrown their weight behind this group, the Islamic State, which is the successor to al-Qaeda in Iraq. So what you see here is this horrible group, Islamic State, that's very barbaric. They have this extreme religious fanaticism and ideology behind them, but they're receiving the support of many Sunni Arabs in the area, in Iraq and Syria, because the alternatives to the Islamic State are government forces that the Sunnis see as much worse to them than the Islamic State. My alternative to the U.S. bombing campaign, to the U.S. military intervention is this. This is the consequence of decades of United States policy in the Middle East that has played one sect against the other. The Islamic State is a Frankenstein of our creation. And as horrible as it is, the purposes behind the United States policy in the Middle East must change to be one of preventing conflict rather than fostering conflict. For decades now, we have supported various regimes in the Middle East that have been despotic, that have been dictatorships, that have oppressed their people, or an alternative, we have supported these groups that have then morphed into these organizations like al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State, and it's now out of control. And so for me, the alternative in Iraq is to stop supporting a Shia government that is horribly corrupt, that is persecuting its own people, stop buying their oil, stop selling their weapons. Look, Amy, when we, as the United States, when we sell the world 70% of its weapons, we have to take responsibility for the havoc that's going to result from that. So a lot of this, to me, is not so much what do we do now, what do we do over the next decades to disengage ourselves from this policy where we have created these Frankensteins, where we have created conditions for civil war, where we have set one group, whether it be by religion, by sect, by ethnicity, against the other. And how do we walk away from that? How do we back out of that and become a much more responsible partner in the world? How do we seek to actually bring about justice, bring about stability, rather than fostering either war or oppression?
Matthew Ho, can you describe your own transformation, how you came to the position you have? You fought in Iraq, you served in Afghanistan, you quit as a State Department official in protest of the war in Afghanistan. Explain the trajectory you took over the years.
Yeah, well, I think for me it begins in 2002 when I'm stationed in the Pentagon. I was put in a very senior position, just happened. I worked directly for the Secretary of the Navy as a Marine Corps captain. And so in the run-up to the war, the Iraq War, and during the initial phases of the Iraq War, I was very close to the decision-making, the policy-making. I could see how things were done, how decisions were made, how assessments were conducted. And I could see very quickly, particularly once the war began in Iraq, and once we started receiving our communications from our forces in Iraq, our classified communications detailing what was occurring on the ground, the dissonance, the disconnect between what policy was being promulgated in Washington, D.C., what assessments were being made, what statements were being made, and what the reality was on the ground. Of course, when I got there in 2004, 2005, I saw that firsthand. I saw how our presence was fueling the occupation, how we were setting one group against the other, how we were aiding corrupt and thuggish militias in power in Iraq. The same thing, too. I came back to D.C., worked in the State Department again on the Iraq desk, and again, in an interagency process, saw that disconnect between what's occurring in Iraq and what we're actually saying. And the refusal by people in the administration by people in the military, in the government, to acknowledge that our policies weren't just harmful, but they were malignant, that they were causing further violence. They were causing groups like Al-Qaeda to gain support. And so this continued until finally I was in Afghanistan in 2009, and seeing all the same things again, seeing the narrative that we have the white hats on, that American troops are dying to protect us, to keep us free, seeing that really what we were doing in Afghanistan was taking part in a civil war. Our presence was fueling the insurgency. We were propping up a corrupt kleptocracy, and that Al-Qaeda had left Afghanistan years before. I decided at that point in 2009, I no longer could take part in it, and here we are 5 years later.
Well, Matthew Ho, you write on your website, quote, "In 2007, after my second deployment to Iraq, PTSD and severe depression took over my life. I began by trying to drink myself to death. Thoughts of suicide became common until they were a near daily presence by 2011. That was what you said. As the nation commemorates Veterans Day tomorrow, what do you want people to understand about the impact of war on those who serve?
With this recent, and I appreciate you bringing it up, Amy, and certainly just if anyone is listening or watching, you can contact me through my website, and I'm happy to talk about my own struggles with PTSD, with alcohol abuse, with suicidality. Because other people helped me, and that's how we survived this. The costs of these wars, I think, are something that's hidden, Amy. The suicides are a constant in the veteran community. This is something that has always occurred. I don't like using the term epidemic because that implies that it's somehow worse now than it was before, and I don't think that's ever been the case. I think men and women coming home from war have always been afflicted with suicide. But we're at the point now
What
where
are the numbers per day? Do you know?
The numbers yes, the numbers are quite striking. And these numbers are conservative because we don't have full data from all the states. It was only a couple of years ago, Amy, that the Veterans Administration actually started tracking veteran suicides on a national level. But right now we're looking at least 22 veterans kill themselves every day. More than 2 of those veterans every day who kill themselves are Iraq or Afghanistan veterans. Those numbers will climb as those veterans get older. But what that means for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans is that more veterans have killed themselves after coming home from Iraq or Afghanistan than have been killed in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan. And as I said, we can expect those numbers to climb. The things I have seen, it's been explained to me that over the course of our lifetime, Iraq and Afghanistan vets, 1 in 5 veterans who saw combat in Iraq or Afghanistan will attempt to kill themselves.
I mean, these are astounding figures, 22 veterans a day in the United States.
At least, Amy, at least. And I say at least because as of now, we only have about 30 states contributing data to the Veterans Administration on how many veterans kill themselves.
More than 8,000 a year.
Exactly. And that's what we know of. Again, that's what we know of. It's 8,000 a year. It's been always said within the veterans community that if you were to build a Vietnam Veterans War Memorial for those who killed themselves after they came home from Vietnam, that memorial would be longer than the memorial we have in Washington, D.C. with its 60,000 names on it. I just had a friend of mine, one of my former officers, one of my lieutenants, just texted me yesterday to tell me one of his former Marines tried to kill himself, shot himself in the head, and that kid, that young man, is now brain dead. And this is something that in the veteran community, we all know this. We see this. It's experienced. And so the importance is, how do you get help? And the problem is like, and as you mentioned when you read from my website, the problem is that we don't get help until we hit rock bottom. And that seems to be another constant in this, is that...
It looks like we just lost Matthew Ho, former State Department official who resigned in protest over his post, the satellite in Raleigh, North Carolina. Matthew Ho quit in 2009. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he served in Iraq from 2004 to 2005. He worked with a State Department Reconstruction and Governments team there from 2006 to 7. He worked as a Marine Corps company commander in Anbar province. He's now a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to New Haven, Connecticut, to Yale University, where a public health worker has just returned from Liberia. He was there and is just finishing his quarantine. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
L'Afrique est pleine de tristesse de voir nos familles mourir. Ne touchons pas nos malades. Ne touchons pas nos mourants, tout le monde est en danger, les jeunes et les anciens. Il faut agir pour nos familles. Ebola, Ebola, invisible ennemi. Ebola, Ebola, invisible ennemi. Ebola, Ebola, invisible ennemi. Ebola, tu es notre ennemi. Si vous vous sentez malade, les docteurs vont vous aider. Je vous rassure, les docteurs vont vous aider. Il y a de l'espoir d'arrêter Ebola. Et confiance aux docteurs. Ebola, Ebola. Confiance aux docteurs.
Africa, Stop Ebola, a collective of African musicians recorded the song to help raise awareness about Ebola in Africa. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Health officials declared the Dallas region to be free of Ebola after the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced Friday it had cleared all 177 people it had been checking for Ebola exposure over the past 3 weeks. The Texas city's Ebola worries began on September 30th when a visiting Liberian man, Thomas Eric Duncan, was taken by ambulance to Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, where he was diagnosed with the disease. He eventually died October 8th and remains the only person to die of Ebola inside the United States. 2 nurses who cared for him came down with Ebola but recovered. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the United Nations is reporting the spread of the virus is slowing in some of the hardest-hit areas of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. But local health officials are warning it's too early to declare a premature victory over the outbreak. This is the head of Liberia's Ebola response, Talbert Yansa.
We are not off the hook here because Sierra Leone and Guinea are still reporting cases. And so Liberia here, we're still reporting fresh cases. We need to continue the intervention, scale them up, accelerate the intervention until Liberia can start reporting 0 cases. And even if we start reporting 0 cases, trust me, when Guinea and Sierra Leone still not reporting 0 cases, our ETUs need to be open.
We go now to New Haven, Connecticut, where we're joined by Ryan Boyko. He's a Yale University graduate student in public health. He was in Liberia for 3 weeks, helping the government set up a computer database of Ebola cases. Soon after his return to the U.S., he was placed in quarantine in his home in New Haven, Connecticut. His quarantine lasted till last Thursday. Ryan Boyko, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk first about what you found when you got to Liberia?
Thanks for having me on. When I got to Liberia, I was in Monrovia, and the whole city seemed a bit shell-shocked, but it was a mix of this fear that was always present along with normal everyday activities. You know, people still need to work, people still need to get food for their families, feed their families, and you know, this is a city of nearly 1.5 million people with a few thousand Ebola cases. So there's this fear was always there, and you could just see it in the streets. But at the same time, there was this mix of that along with people going about their daily business.
And the work exactly that you did there, and then what happened upon your return?
So I helped the government, the Ministry of Health, build a web app and an Android phone application and a database, and where local community leaders could use the Android app to notify the Ministry of Health about cases or deaths or other relevant events happening in their local area. And then the people at the Ministry of Health could then see in real time where in the city they needed to send people to mount a response, either to get people to Ebola treatment units or get a funeral team there or do other things like that.
And were you successful, and is this working now in Liberia?
Yeah, so that database and that Android app are being used in Monrovia throughout the city now, and I think that it's one of many pieces that's contributing, hopefully, to the continued decline in new cases in Liberia.
Ryan, it must have been a very serious decision you made to go to Liberia, given how contagious Ebola is. Can you talk about the decision you made for other people who are weighing this right now?
Well, in my own case, I knew I wouldn't be treating Ebola patients, that, you know, I would be working with IT personnel and with people at the Ministry of Health. And so there's always that little bit of fear, you know, some small level of risk, given that the virus is infecting thousands of people there. And so it's not, you know, as contained as in the U.S. in New York City or Dallas or somewhere like that. So there was a little fear, but at the same time, Ebola really is spread by bodily fluids of very sick people. So I wasn't, I didn't think that the risk to me was anything like what the risk that these healthcare workers or those kinds of people are facing. And so I have a lot of respect for people who choose to take on that level of risk for themselves. But I think that a lot of people, myself included, feel like the only way that we could get a handle on this is to actually go to the source and help to end it at the source. And
so can you talk about what happened to you when you returned?
So I was here for a couple days, and then I got sick with a little bit of a fever. And so I went to Yale New Haven Hospital. I called, and they used all the precautions, and I got an Ebola test there, and it came back negative twice, and my symptoms resolved. And that was the point when the government of Connecticut decided to quarantine me, and so sent me back to my home to stay there for over 2 weeks in quarantine.
How did you feel about that? Did you feel you were treated correctly?
No, so I was really concerned about the effect it might have on other volunteers, first of all, moving forward, and that it might have a big effect on our ability to fight the epidemic in West Africa if we started quarantining all these returning workers. And then I felt personally like it was very unfair, especially because I had been monitoring myself, which is what the CDC recommends, which is what one needs to do, because after you develop symptoms, you can become contagious. And I had done that, and I reported it as soon as I developed any symptoms, and then to be told, because I reported it essentially, that I would be quarantined seemed particularly egregious.
I want to turn to a recent interview with Casey Hickox, the nurse who treated Ebola patients in Sierra Leone and fought against mandatory quarantine in the U.S. when she returned last month. She was asked by CNN's Anderson Cooper why she defied state authorities in both New Jersey and Maine. This was part of her response.
Coming back to the Newark airport and seeing complete chaos and disorganization and no leadership was a really frustrating sight to see. And when policies are put in place and sort of the policies aren't organized well and staff aren't trained well. It's just a scary situation. But of course, the biggest reason that I fought is because I felt so much fear and confusion, and I imagined what my fellow aid workers were going to feel if they came back to this same situation. And the more I thought about the fact that these policies are being made by politicians, really not the experts in the field, the more I felt like I had no choice but to fight back.
And now I understand Casey Hickox says she will be leaving Maine. Your quarantines overlapped, though you personally didn't. You're in New Haven. She is in Maine. I think her quarantine ends today. Your response to Casey Hickox speaking out, and did that inspire you to speak out, Ryan?
I have a lot of respect for Casey Hickox. We've actually exchanged some emails and text messages, and I have a lot of respect for her. When I was put into quarantine, actually Connecticut was the only state in the nation with a stated policy that far exceeded the CDC guidelines, and a policy at the time they were saying they would quarantine anyone returning from these 3 countries. And so I made the decision in consultation with public health lawyers that I was talking to that the best thing to do at that moment was to try to get Connecticut government to quietly walk back these quarantines instead of fighting loudly in the press and in court. And then, of course, the events where Craig Spencer became symptomatic with Ebola in New York, and then Casey Hickox came back, and there was the very loud story between Chris Christie and Governor Cuomo and her, and so that did inspire me to come out and speak out publicly at that point, where I then thought that was the best way to go.
Ryan, I wanted to share some comments made last month by NBC cameraman and Ebola survivor Ashoka Mukbo, whom you met in Liberia at a restaurant. He was asked about the mandatory quarantine being imposed on Casey Hickox. He also talked, as you do, about Craig Spencer being treated in New York. This is Ashoka Mukbo on CNN.
She's earned the right to, have a sense of her own safety and her own risk factor to others. And I don't think that Dr. Spencer endangered anyone. My feeling is, and again, I'm not an expert, this is just my own view on the exposure that I've had to Ebola, is I think that Governor Christie is playing politics right now. It seems to me that it's an effort to, work with public opinion rather than listen to the advice of the experts. And I just think that it's counterproductive. These are people who have gone and endangered their lives to work with people who have very limited resources and are dying in, relatively large numbers. So to make it more difficult and to treat them as if they're a potential problem as opposed to a public asset, I just think it's a shame. And I don't think it's the right way to act.
Again, speaking on CNN, NBC cameraman Ashoka Mukbo, we just have 20 seconds for you to respond, Ryan, since you met him in Liberia.
Well, I think that he was also doing great work there. He'd been living there for a while, and I think documenting what's happening is very important. But I totally agree with him that the heroes of this response are the Liberians and the Westerners who go and actually are treating these patients, putting themselves at risk, and we need to treat them like returning heroes because they're protecting the rest of us.
Ryan Boyko, I want to thank you for being with us. Third-year Yale University graduate student in public health. Went to Liberia, returned, and was put in quarantine at his home in New Haven, Connecticut. That does it for the show. I'll be speaking in Maplewood, New Jersey on Thursday. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.